Now we're about to hear from Ben Edmunds. The title of Ben's lecture is Modern and Secure PHP. Let's hear it for Ben.
It's very bright up here. Hey, hope everybody's having fun. This is my first time in Serbia. It's been great. And it's also my first conference in like 2 years, so I'm really stoked to be here. And thanks to the organizers for still putting it on, figuring out how to make this happen. It's really exciting. Today we're going to talk about modern and secure PHP. About 12 years ago or so, I want to say it was PHP 4.2 or so, I tried out Python. And at the time, it was like, wow, Python's a really cool language. They have all these tools. They have, dependency tooling and all this stuff. And PHP felt, pretty behind the times back then. And we've come a long way. Just a couple months ago, a coworker of mine who does PHP most of the time tried out Python. And I asked him what his impression was. And he said, well, it was fine, but it felt like going back in time after being used to PHP. So that's how far we've come in the past 10 years or so. I'm Ben Edmunds. I do some open source work. I'm a member of the PHP Fig core committee. I've written a couple books and occasional blog posts. I do the PHP Town Hall podcast with my good buddy Matt Trask. And I'm a staff engineer at Wayfair. So today we'll talk about what's new to PHP and some stuff that's not so new. Hopefully, if you haven't used PHP in a while, this will be a refresher for what's available to you. And then if you are still using PHP to this day, you'll learn a few things along the way. We'll cover what's new in both 7 and 8. So here's what we'll cover. We'll go through exceptions, traits, and interfaces. So these have been around for a while, but we'll touch on them a little bit. Closures have also been around for a while, but then anonymous classes are a bit newer, so we'll see how to use that. We'll go through Null Coalescing, the new type hinting that's available, Variadic Functions, the new arrow functions and named arguments, constructor property promotion, the Nullsafe Operator, and password hashing that was added in 5.5, and then how that's been updated. And then we'll also cover some of the cooler things under the hood, like FFI and the JIT. And then a few tools, so the built-in web server, Composer, and some testing tools that are available. And then we'll wrap it up with the standards we have now, with the FIG and the PSRs. So let's start it off with the basics, exceptions and errors. They've been around for a while, but here's a little refresher. As we know exceptions today, they were added way back in PHP 5, but then they also had some enhancements in PHP 7. So this is your standard exception. You're going to try to do something. If it fails, you're going to go to your catch block and handle your exception there. You're catching it based on that exception class there. In PHP 7, exception and error were both updated to implement the throwable interface. And so this gives you a standard interface that you can use to catch both of them. So you might catch an error with just catch error. You might be able to catch an error and an exception separately. But since they both extend throwable, you could also just catch throwable, and that gives you both of them. Also, PHP 7.1, though, added multi-catch exceptions. So you could catch both of them here like this with the pipe between them. Traits were added in 5.4. Surprisingly, I still don't see this used a ton in PHP, and it's one of the cooler features. So it allows you to group things together, but without strict inheritance. So here we have an example. We have our base user, and then that has a method of getName. And then let's say we wanted to use that. So here we have our admin user, and that admin user is going to use the base user. And what that does is that gives us access to the methods inside the base user. And so here, we could use it. So we instantiate the new admin user, and then we're going to call getName on that. And even though the admin user didn't have a getName method, because it was using that trait, we get the output there. Where you see this used a lot of frameworks will use it for things like loggables. And so you want to be able to log from your classes, but they're not necessarily a type of a logger, right? So if you're in, say, a model, that model needs to be able to log things, but it doesn't need to inherit anything from a logger. So here we have a trait loggable with just a method for logging. And then we have the class post. This would be like a post model. And so here we're going to get something from the database. And now we can use the loggable trait, and that gives us access to the logging methods. And so we could just use that this log straight from our get method there. And so if you instantiate the new post and then you call get on that post, you would see the output from the logger. Laravel does something cool with this where it actually lets you override. It's kind of core model functionality. So you can use the soft deletes trait, and that will change the way your deletes happen in your model by default. So it goes from hard deletes to soft deletes just by using the trait. It's an interesting way to override functionality there. Interfaces, they've been around for a while, but we're going to keep mentioning them, so I want to just update you. So here we have a MyLogger class, pretty similar to what you just saw. Then we have the interface logger. So the interface is just a contract for what we're going to perform in this API. So here we have a log method. So we're saying anything that implements the logger interface will have a log method. And so MyLogger implements logger, and then we just need to make sure we call or we define a log method. If you don't, you'll get an exception, which is good. So if you try to use it and you forget to implement a method, you'll get a warning about it before you get to production. Closures, they've been around since 5.3. In general, it's just an anonymous function, or anonymous function. So here we have our get route, and this is where you see them used a lot. And so we're just going to define a function, and then we're going to return, in this case, just a template. You can do some cooler things with it and get a little closer to functional style programming. So here we have an array. We're going to filter that array with an array filter. And then we're going to pass in a function that does the filtering. And so that function would have our logic in there. So here we're just going to filter for anything greater than 5. So we return 6, 7, and 8. You can also group these together, right? So we could have an array map that takes a function, and then also array filter that takes a function, and kind of build those together in a functional style. Anonymous classes. These were added in PHP 7. So let's go back to our logger here. So we have the same trait as before, the loggable trait. We have the same interface as before. And so let's update this a little bit. So let's say we want the ability to set a logger and pass that in. So maybe instead of the default logger, which in our case is just echoing something, maybe you want to change the format that that's echoed in. You want to change where it writes. Maybe you want to write it to a database instead of to a flat file, the other way around. So here we have our post class is using loggable, just like before. But now we could use an anonymous class here to set a new logger. So we have new class, implements logger, and there's no name to that. It's an anonymous class. It's one-time use. We're just going to make this and throw it away, basically. And we're defining our log function, and then we're changing the way we output the log so that we can change the formatting. So it's a pretty quick and simple way to pass through a class to that. So there's no need to set up a new file for it, require it, pass it in, all that. You can just do it right there. And then if you use that, you would get the new output from that anonymous class that you defined. The Null Coalescing operator was added in PHP 7. And so before we had to do a lot of stuff like this. You had, especially in views, a lot of code that looks like this, where you're checking to see, does this thing exist? Is it null? If not, use this. Otherwise, use the default. That's a lot simpler now with this syntax. You can just say, use this, or fall back to this default. So types, probably the biggest change to PHP that most developers will notice if you haven't used PHP since 7. So we have scalar type hinting now. We're legit language with type hinting. So the way you use this is in your file, you declare strict types. It's a file-by-file basis so that you can use this where you want to. You don't have to use it everywhere. In here, we have an add nums function, and we're going to have two variables to this, an a and a b, and we're going to type hint that those are floats. And so if you try to pass through something that's not a float to this, you're going to get a fatal error. You get a type error for that. This is very helpful to make sure that the data you're passing around matches the data you expect, so there's no surprises. You can also catch for this, right? So you could try to add the nums and then catch the type error. All right, so union types were also added in PHP 8, and this is pretty handy because before, if you had something that was like a mixed type, and it could be, say maybe it's an int or it could be an array, you want to be able to hint on that. And so here we can have multiple types defined and take either one of those. These are not all the types supported, but probably the ones you'll use most. The ones on the left have been around since 7. The ones on the right are newer. So iterable was added in 7.1, object in 7.2, and mix was added in 8. Return types, basically the same idea, but for what you return, it was added in PHP 7. So we just had this colon and then the type at the end of the function definition, and that's going to make sure that what we return out matches the type we expect. Looks like that. If you return a type that's not what you expect, so let's say we let floats into this function, but we only let ints out, we're going to get a fatal error here because we tried to return a float back from the function. Also, knowable types were added in 7.1, so you can say, you know, I expect a float here, but I'm not requiring anything to be passed here. It could be a null, and so that's a knowable type. So you could just pass a into this function. Also notice that we're using the Null Coalescing operator there to default b to a 0. You can also do a knowable return type as well. So maybe your function usually returns something, but it might also return null, maybe in an error case or a false case. And then void return types are added in 7.1. So that just says this function doesn't return anything, and give me an error if it does for some reason. Type properties were added in 7.4. So this is really handy. In your classes, you can now define the types for the properties of that class. So here we have a numbers class, and we're defining that it's going to be a float for our base value. We also have Variadic Functions, which we've had Variadic Functions, but the syntax for them changed, and it's a bit easier to use now. So we now have the splat operator since PHP 5.6. So that's what the ... there is. So it's saying take as many parameters as they pass in and then convert that to an array, and then you get an array in your function to use. So here we're saying add nums, 1, 2, 3, 4, the parameters are passing in, but then inside our function we have the numbers array that we can use. All right, arrow functions were added in 7.4, and so this is just syntactic sugar. It is a shorter syntax for anonymous functions, and it uses variables from the parent scope by default. So here we have, let's say we're doing like a shopping cart. We have the base cost of $5, and then we have add-ons that you can add on. So we're saying add-on cost is a function that just adds the base and the add-on. And so note, though, that we're using that base cost without a use statement or with anything to pass that in. We have access to the parent scope straight from that function. And the old way we would have to do that is a function that has a use to use the base cost. So it's just a shorthand way to define that. Named arguments were added in PHP 8. So this is something other languages have for a while. People have been asking for. We finally got it into the language. It's really just a way to keep things a little simpler, keeps things more organized. You can see what's happening a little easier in your code. Instead of having to remember, you know, the fourth argument to this function is this, you can see it named right there. So the way you do this is you define your function just like you normally would. So here I'm adding a round argument to this function just so you can see what we're doing. If round is true, we're going to just round the number before we return it. So here, we can use this the traditional way, right? So we have our addNums function. We're passing in an array, and then the second parameter is false for false equals do not round. Or the new way with named arguments is we say addNums, and then we name each argument we're passing in. The nice thing about the naming is, one, when you're reading this code, it's just very obvious what's happening. But also, you don't have to worry about the order. If they're named, it'll fix it for you and put them in the right order. Constructor property promotion was added in PHP 8. And so before, you would have to do something like this pretty often. So we're going to pass in a base value to our numbers, and then we're going to set a property on the numbers function equals that base value. With property promotion, we can now just say public float base, and that's going to automatically be promoted up. It gets rid of a lot of boilerplate code there. The Nullsafe Operator was added in PHP 8. And so before you had to do a lot of stuff like this as well. So you say, get my user. If the user's not null, get the cart. If the cart's not null, get the cost. And so you ended up with a lot of branches like this throughout the code. Now we can do this. So this is really an advantage for method calls. And so we can say session get user. If that's good, get cart. If that's good, get the total. So this is for null checks against method returns. A lot of the updates we've got to PHP over the last few years just make the code a lot simpler to read, a lot simpler to write. Let's talk a little bit about the security functions that were added. So previously in PHP, you had to find a library to handle password hashing or authentication. You might have to write it yourself. It can be a bit dangerous because the hashing algorithms change every so often. You know, before we used SHA-1 for everything, but then that was broken, and so then we moved to like bcrypt. And if you write this yourself, or if you use another library, you have to stay up to date on what's current, and you have to worry about your site being hacked just because your code's out of date and that algorithm's no longer valid. PHP's added password hashing functions into the core. So here we have password hash. Right now the default is bcrypt. There's also options for Argon 2, and that stays up to date automatically for you in the PHP core, so you don't have to worry about it. We had some other helper functions for this. So we had password verify. So password hash hashes your password. Password verify will validate your plaintext password against your hash. And then password rehash will check to see if you need to rehash that password. This is really handy for that case where the algo you used previously is now up to date. How do you update your users to the newer algo? You use rehash. So the way you do this is something like this in your login code. So we're going to verify the password. So we have the posted password, and then we have the hash password in our database. So the upass is, say, from a user object. We're going to validate or verify that that's the correct password. If it is, we're going to check to see if it needs to be rehashed. If it does need to be rehashed, then we're going to go hash it again and then save it back to the database. So what this does, though, is every time a user logs in, it's going to make sure they're on the most up-to-date algo. The risk here is you will have users that just don't log in anymore, and so their passwords will be on an older algo, and that might be something you need to check for in the future. Maybe you need to invalidate those users, mark them as no longer active, something like that in case your database is stolen. But this is a good way to keep your active users up to date over time. We also have some low-level updates to PHP. FFI is pretty cool. What it does is it's a foreign, it's the foreign function interface. It was introduced in PHP 7.4. It allows us to use C code directly without needing to compile extensions or jump through any hoops that you used to have to. You can now just directly in your code give access to C. So let's take this add num function from before, and let's add an absolute call to it. So we're going to use C's absolute function. We could use PHP's, but then that wouldn't be a good example of FFI. So here we're going to say libc equals FFI and then cdef. And so cdef is a C definition. And so we're going to map int absolute int j. And then the second argument there is going to be the path to that library. And so that's the path to libc on my local Mac. So you have cdef there, and then the definition, and then the path. And then if you want to use that, you now can just call it directly. So we had sum equals add nums from before. This is going to give us -8 if we just echo it out directly. But now we could call the libc absolute function on it, and we get 8. So the JIT is added in PHP 8. So let's walk through. We'll have to get into how does PHP interpret code, how does the op cache work, and now how does the JIT change that. So let's start kind of at the beginning there. So on the left here is how code execution in PHP normally works, or normally worked. We take our PHP script, we compile it into opcodes, or bytecodes, also called. And these are opcodes that the VM understands. And then the VM compiles those opcodes to machine code, and then it executes it. So we have multiple steps here. On the right-hand side, this is how we execute code since opcache was added. It's the same steps, except that we're caching the opcodes, and then we're using those cache opcodes if we have one. What this does is this lets us skip a step if we already have the opcodes, and speeding up performance. This can provide some pretty big performance gains for code that runs multiple times. So PHP 7.4 expanded on this by allowing preload opcodes to the cache on startup. So this means, so before the way we had it was I come in for the first time on startup to a PHP process. There's not going to be any opcodes. It's going to build out that cache, and then it'll let me move forward from there. This could give a pretty slow experience for that first run. With preloading, now we can say, I want on startup to go ahead and parse this and put this into the opcode cache. It lets you preload a lot of information in there. At Wayfair, we use opcache preloading for a lot of our web stack, and it actually gave us pretty significant performance gains once we implemented it. All right, so now to the JIT. The JIT is a just-in-time compiler, and it allows another layer of caching. So now we can cache the machine code as well. This allows us to skip opcodes and compilation altogether, because if we already had the machine codes, we can just go straight to that. So there are two JITs available. There's the function JIT and the tracing JIT. And let's look at the function JIT first. So the function-based JIT, it analyzes each function and then attempts to compile all the paths through that function, like with all the arguments that are passed and everything, and then caches that. The problem with this approach is that a lot of the code just isn't performant, right? So you have to do all the work to execute all that code, build out the cache, and just the overhead is pretty huge. This can be helpful in certain environments, but especially in web environments that we're probably seeing, it's not. The tracing JIT attempts to solve this. So what it does is it keeps a tracer of everything that's run. So that's the opcodes, operands, classes, functions, everything that's ran through there. And then based on the usage throughout your code base, it will attempt to cache intelligently so that it knows the code that's used most often, it's going to cache that code, thus giving you the best performance bang for your buck. So to use the JIT, you need to both enable opcache and enable the JIT. Opcache.jit takes two different options. It has a standard option, which is off. It has tracing, has function, and it has, I think, one or two other options. But those are the three you'll usually see, either off, tracing, or function. The JIT can lead to pretty noticeable performance gains for the right type of application. The downside is applications that benefit from the JIT aren't usually ones that we write in PHP. There are things like machine learning or big data, graphics manipulation, things like that. What this does, though, is it really does open the door for new types of applications to be written in PHP. We can really do machine learning applications in PHP now that we have the JIT. It's probably worth testing in your large-scale applications, even if it is a web application. You won't necessarily get performance gains. You'll probably see a lot of gains from opcache and from preloading, but it's worth at least trying the JIT out to see how it affects your application. So we also have some legit tools in PHP now. For a long time, PHP was like the Wild West with nothing defined for you. So we have the built-in web server. This is just a way to run code locally without needing Apache or Nginx or any of that setup. You can just quickly run something and try it out. I've used this a lot in the past when I was doing consulting work. I would just CD into the directory that I was working on for that client, boot up a web server real quick, try something out, and move on. Composer, hopefully most of us are using Composer at this point. It's same package management for PHP. Composer really brought PHP up to the next level of languages with good support and good tooling and a good ecosystem to work in. A core part of that is autoloading via PSR4. So if you define your Composer JSON file, you set what you want to require in your application. You then install that. That's going to generate a lock file which says, hey, I pulled this application down, it's this version, here's the path to it, etc. You can commit your lock files, and then other people that are working on your application are also pulling down those same exact versions of each dependency. And then you can install updates from that. And then you can also update that so that you update your dependencies on a regular basis and keep them up to the latest version. And with autoloading, that means that once you define that and install your Composer dependencies, you don't have to do long require statements anymore. You just call your function or your class, and it's automatically included. So we also have some pretty great testing tools in PHP now. At Wayfair, we utilize tons of deployment pipelines with lots of different tests. It gives you a lot of confidence in your code when you can deploy something and know it's been ran through a pretty legit test suite and that it's not breaking anything. So first off, we have unit testing. So the popular tools for that are PHP Unit, Vhat, and PHP Spec. Probably PHP Unit is used more than anything else. And this is what a simple test in PHP Unit looks like. So we're going to include the framework, and then we're going to assert that something is true. So in this case, we're defining a new API, and then we're verifying that we can auth through that API. It's a stupid example, but really you're just programmatically determining that your code works the way you expect it to work. Then you can run the unit test. You get output immediately that tells you what tests were ran, what assertions were ran, if there were any failures. You can run this locally, which is great, but then also, like I said, you can run this in a pipeline so that you see it before you merge a PR, before you deploy something to production. We also have some integration testing tools. So Selenium and Codeception are some of the more popular ones there. This is what running a Codeception test looks like. So here we have the front page test. We're going to assert that we're on the page and that we see the text home on that page. And then you can run that in the same way and get that output. If you combine unit test and an integration test, you gain a lot of confidence that your application is working the way you expect. And now we also have some good standards in PHP. For a very long time, PHP was just kind of do whatever you want. Every application works differently. Over the past few years, though, we've really developed standards, worked on them, so that as you move across applications in PHP, you can be pretty confident that they'll work in similar ways. The PHP Fig is the Framework Interoperability Group. Recently, we went through an overhaul, and it's on PHP Fig 3.0 now. The idea there is it makes it easier to contribute, easier to keep track of everything that's going on, and it splits things into smaller groups. It's also not quite as much drama and politics as there used to be if you ever followed it back in the 1.0 days. The idea behind the Fig is that we're going to get together large projects in PHP, find out how we're doing things, discuss the trade-offs, and then define a standard that helps us do things in similar ways. That way, if you switch between Laravel and Slim, you don't have to start all over in the way everything's handled. You'll have a general basis for how things work. There's some pretty big member projects in there. So Composer, Slim, Cake, a lot of core frameworks have gotten together. Also, these are the current members. There's frameworks that have been members in the past and then walked away. That doesn't mean that they don't still use the PSRs. That just means they no longer contribute to the Fig. A PSR is a PHP standards recommendation. So that's just a recommendation of how you should handle something. And then if your app uses it, it complies to it, others will know how to structure things. We mostly cover auto-loading, interfaces, and style guides. And so here are some of the more popular PSRs. PSR 4, which is auto-loading. If you use Composer, you're using that. PSR 1 is basic coding standards. That one's pretty well received. PSR 12, which gets a little more detailed on your coding standards, that one's iffy on if your framework supports it and uses it. Also, a lot of people will use parts of it, but maybe not the full thing. So you can't say you fully comply with the PSR if you don't use it all, but you can, steal ideas from it. PSR 7 is the HTTP message interface. 6 is the caching interface. 3 is the logger interface. Those are the ones you see in the wild most often. And then I'm personally on the work group for the PSR 20 clock interface. So expect to see something coming from that in a few weeks, hopefully. We're currently working through the spec now. All right, I'm going to leave you with some resources. So php.net is still a great resource to use. Another one is just modern frameworks. Go read the code for the framework you're using. Don't just only implement using the framework. Actually dig into the core of it. Figure out how they're doing things. Compare the way like Laravel and Symfony do something underlying, and that'll teach you a lot about the different trade-offs and options you have available to you. PHP the Right Way, it's both a website and a book that you can buy. The website's completely free. This is just people contributing with guides on how to do things in PHP, and it's more modern and up-to-date than a lot of the resources you get out there. If you just Google how to do something in PHP, a lot of times you get something that's like 10 years old. PHP the Right Way gives you something that's pretty modern and up-to-date. And then if you're interested in working with me, we have the careers portal. Email me if you're interested. I'd be happy to talk to you. And let's do a Q&A.
Okay, let's see whether we have any questions for Ben. Just raise your arm and the mic will come your way. Any questions? Ben, it seems that everything was clear. Okay. Thank you once again. Oh, we have a question. Okay. Forget this, thank you.
Can you comment a little bit about threading that is upcoming in PHP?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Threading.
What was that?
Can you say a few words about it? What do you think it will... Yeah.
Threading. I don't have any slides on that. We are getting fibers in PHP 8.1, I believe. I think the RFC passed. It was up for vote recently. Yeah, I just haven't added it to the talk yet. Usually I wait until it's actually released to add it. The RFCs can be weird, right? Because something looks like it's going to pass and then it doesn't, and that can be upsetting. Or you talk about fibers and then it's not out yet. There are also options already in PHP for threading, and so you can do things like call threads with pthreads or whatever, but they're not great. Fibers will definitely be a better way to do that.
We have another one from Alexander Lysachenko.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I have a question regarding running PHP in a modern infrastructure. For example, if you will run modern PHP in Docker or Kubernetes, what recommendations can you provide for running PHP in such environments in a secure way?
So we do a lot with both. what we usually do is we set up a base image. So we'll pull in like the CentOS image. Then we'll set up PHP on top. And then we'll have the custom PHP and INI that gets loaded. And then we'll build that out as an image that's available in our artifact repository for the rest of the company to use, with a few options in there. So we have a custom script that's install extension, and that maps you through to just a quick way to install additional PHP extensions. And so it'll install the extension, set up the INI for you, all that. And so in your Docker file, you say, use this base image, which is the PHP image, and then you have the run script that's install extension, and then a list of the extensions you want to add. And then after that, it's either we use Nginx sidecars a lot, so call Nginx, or you could do Apache or whatever. The way we usually structure that is we'll have the PHP image and the Nginx image, and they run side by side in containers. And so the Nginx image just knows how to call into PHP to use it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any more questions? Going once, going twice. Okay, that's it. It's time for our lunch break. Thank you, Ben. Let's
Cool.
hear it for
Thanks
Ben.
all.